Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 11 of The Drums of Doom, part 2 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga, by me. And we'll be starting up on bottom page 125, top of 126, the Great Council Hall, returning to the Dwarves' Brewmaster Challenge. Okay. Judges, the Lady Molly said, before the excitement could in any way diminish, are you ready for the fourth challenge? We are, my lady, Sir John replied. Then, Master Christie, what drink do you offer next? My lady, my next challenge is a honey mead, crafted by the barbarian tribes of the far north. It is a most unique fermentation, with an exquisite flavor. Every sip of it is as gratifying as the first. Drink up. It was again Sir Tiernan whom the audience looked to for this fourth test, for of all the judges he lived closest to the northern tribes. Despite this, he seemed no less interested in the mead than in any of the others that he tried before. Indeed, he seemed just as surprised as the rest of them. Delicious, he first thought, very smooth, yet bold like the Northmen themselves. Even though it wasn't chilled, it still seemed cold, as if it was still cooled by the mountain glaciers that must have given birth to it. It would be quite a brew for a hot day, and yet it was not so cold that it chilled him. Warmth filled his heart, and he knew that it would be an excellent elixir against the frigid north winds. It was sweet, but not too sweet like some meads, and overall a wonderful creation. He would certainly try to add it to his own private stock in the future. He gave the mead his fullest attention, and when he was satisfied that he'd unlocked what mysteries that it had for him, he made ample notes upon his tablet. He then rested for a time, listening to the last few lines of Sir William's song, The Charge of the Midday Sun, before rinsing with spring water and turning the moment glass. It was once again time for Kegporter ale. The ale tricked his lips in a unique fashion. Whereas the mead was somewhat sweet, the ale complemented it, bringing him back to a comfortable place, like his father's den back at Frostbrand. The mead had cooled him, but the ale brought him back to the warmth of an easy chair and a warm fire. His own family was unusually human for Grey Elves, and although nature's voice still sung to them, they had learned to appreciate such human things as bread and cheese, meat and potatoes, and a comfortable chair after a hard day's work. Make no mistake, however, for he was indeed elven, but he'd learned better than most how to walk and live in the world of men. The ale brought him back to that comfortable feeling of home, so different from his last sampling of it. When he was through, he swished with spring water, turned the moment glass, and jotted down a few notes. Molly's voice soon prepared them for the next event. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for the fifth sampling of the contest? We are, my lady, Tisno said, and I must say that this is the finest gathering of people in centuries. Standing up and leaning over the table, he offered Master Christie his cup with his right hand, while simultaneously adjusting the curl of his mustache with his left. And what brew do you have for us this time, Master Christie? This ale is special indeed, he said, because it came to our shores aboard a pirate ship from across the sea. Alas, for the barrels that bore it were anonymous. I have therefore chosen to call it Arundish Ale. Its taste and body is without equal. Drink up. Tisno wasted no time. His palate cleansed and rested, he brought his cup to his lips with all the excitement that filled the hall. Cold, wet, and refreshing, it was indeed quite good. Its flavor was bold and adventurous, with just a hint of blueberry. It had a fine clarity and a lively fizz that clung to his mustache. Thoughts of his youth came to him unbidden. He finally found himself dreaming of his past in the town cobbler. 3 centuries had come and gone since then, but the Arundish ale brought his memory back with a clarity he could never have imagined. He and his friends had been doing their required charity work late at night for Handover's elderly cobbler. While they worked, they would whistle and sing merry tunes, dance a jig, and finish the old man's shoes while he slept. Gnomish magic kept their labors silent and secret. The work was hard and went on nightly for several years. Toiling with a love of work that only gnomes possess, they formed friendships that had stayed with them to this very day. When the cobbler awoke to find all his work done, the gratitude and relief that showed in his face was reward enough for them. Arundish ale really took him back, awakening threads of memories he thought that he had forgotten. The ale lingered in the past, and try as he might, he could not easily bring it into the future. Swishing with spring water, he turned the moment glass. When he was again ready for Kegporter ale, he was still a little sad for times gone by. But one sip of Muldrin's brew straightened his mustache and nearly turned his eyes from green to blue. Excellent. Delicious. And in the present were but a few of the thoughts that came to his mind. Judges, the Lady Molly asked, are you ready for the next sampling? We are indeed ready, Sir Tiernan said, with nods from the other judges. And so it went through the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th entries to the challenge. The last entry was a barley malt brew from Eitzel that had nearly tipped the scale away from Kegporter ale, but Muldrin's ale had won the judges' hearts over for the 9th time. The tension in the hall had risen to a tumult, and few in the audience could sit through it. This was partly due to the fact that they had consumed enormous amounts of various intoxicating beverages, and partly due to the intensity of the contest. No challenger had ever come so far in the history of the Mountain Dwarves, and the 10th brew seemed to be Master Christie's wild card. Ladies and gentlemen, Molly said, judges and all, I thank you. It has truly been a day to remember. Master Christie, one brew remains. What drink will you now enter into the challenge? I have traveled far across our fair lands, and I have even journeyed once into the fairy court. It was an accident, of course, for how was I to know that the lovely bed of moss that I had chosen for a bed one night was at the heart of a fairy ring? While I slept, I was carried off by a host of the little people to a banquet hall in a land within the land. Once there, I discovered that my diminutive captives were as large as I, or rather I was as small as they, the truth of which I'll never know. They invited me to their party, and we danced and drank for the night. I must have drunk too much, for when I again awoke, 3 months and a day had passed, and I was left atop of the fairy mound just as if I'd lain there the night before. In my pocket was a bottle, and whether I or the fairies had put it there, I could not remember, but that bottle was as magical as the fairies themselves. The bottle can pour forth the fairies' drink without limit. The liquid is indescribable and enchanting, but as far as I know, the drink itself is natural. Perhaps Master Tomzu could test it. Of course. Doing as requested, he cast his spell of detection upon it, and indeed, it was of a natural origin, and only its container held magical energy. It is, as Master Christie says. Then let me pour everyone's glass, Christie said, and may the best brewer win. Soon the judges had begun tasting and testing, perhaps even harder than on the first or second challenges, because they knew just how much was now at stake. One judge had remained quiet, contemplative, and most noble throughout the evening, Sir John Anderson of Munson. He would often answer a question with a nod or a wink, if either would suffice, but he was also capable of deep introspection and long and detailed explanation, and for this the audience grew suddenly silent, and hardly a breath did they take, for they were striving too hard to focus. This was because his words came carefully measured, powerful, and weighty, and they dared not miss the slightest detail of the moment. Sir John sat tall in his high-backed chair, and yet he was relaxed and composed, with his left leg outstretched to relieve the pains of an old injury that he'd suffered during the Flemish invasion of North Sicily so many years before. His creased forehead, receding hairline, and bright eyes portrayed his true wisdom. He graciously accepted Master Christie's cup. Smelling its aroma, he gently wetted his lips and was himself amazed. The fairy wine was totally unique, and his heart was filled with the desire to dance. Indeed, many in the stands of the hall had begun to do so, and even Tomzu, the wise and venerable wizard, had left his seat to spin about with one of the waitresses. Sir John allowed himself a moment of merriment, tapping his feet and moving to the rhythm of Sir William's music. The wine filled his heart with the wild abandon of youth and the unbridled nature that was the fairies themselves. The effects grew stronger with each sip, becoming quite intoxicating. Sir John then found himself taken aback. This was truly a drink too potent for mortals, be they elf, dwarf, halfling, or gnome, and he politely refused a second cup. His notes were brief and to the point. Swishing with spring water, he turned the moment glass and requested another cup of Kegporter ale. The dwarves' drink soon brought with it a memory from the past, from the wars, but it was not an unpleasant one. He'd been sitting at a long table of soldiers eating dinner when his red-haired friend at the table's end asked for the salt. The mead hall was full of hungry soldiers, talking of home and other matters, and no one heard his friend's request. "Salt, please," the soldier finally shouted, and in that instant the salt shaker suddenly rose up and floated through the air, across the busy table, and into the waiting hand of his friend. His fellow soldiers sat quietly awestruck while his friend casually finished his dinner. It was a magical moment unanswered, because his friend soon died in battle before he could explain his strange ability. Nevertheless, the ale carried the memory with honor and without sadness. And so Sir John came to a swift conclusion. That's a true story from my uncle, John Anderson of Munson, of World War II. He was there, he experienced it, and swore to me that it was a true story of telekinesis. That soldier wanted the salt, and by gum, he got it. Okay. The Lady Molly quietly waited until all the judges were ready and then spoke. "Gentlemen, are you ready to deliberate?" "We are, my lady." "Then please exit to the outer hall and return once you've reached your verdict." "Verdict." "Yes, my lady." Well, my noble audience, it has been an exciting day to say the least. While they are deliberating, let us all enjoy the remaining food and drink. Sir William, can you play us a merry tune? How about the Ballad of Daldry Moor? "That would be wonderful," Molly said joyfully. And then there was much rejoicing, and a final round of betting among the gamblers before the judges returned. The crowd grew eerily silent as the Lady Molly asked, "Judges, have you reached a verdict?" "We have, my lady." "Then, Sir John, will you please read your decision aloud for the entire crowd to hear?" "Yes, my lady," he said, lifting himself up to his full and proud height. "Master Christie and Chief Kegporter, noble citizens and friends, we have deliberated and we have arrived at a unanimous decision. Despite the many and unique beverages provided to us from around the nation, none are as satisfying and complete as Kegporter ale. We have compiled the notes of each of the judges into one document, and we have each signed it with our noble seals. We can conclude only this, that Kegporter ale is still the smoothest, least bitter, most refreshing, and incredibly gratifying brew in the entire world." Master Christie and his men looked crestfallen, for indeed they must have been deeply affected by the verdict. The crowd was in an uproar, and no single voice could be heard. The Lady Molly then held up her right hand, and there it remained for some moments before the roar of the audience settled. "Do the judges have any words for the challenger?" "I do," said Sir Tanion. "Master Christie, in our reckoning, No brewer has ever come closer to matching Kegporter ale in all of history, and for that you should be honored. Perhaps in your future journeys you will find even better drinks in return. I think that Brewmaster Kegporter's ale will reign supreme well beyond my lifetime. Do you have any requests of the panel? I would indeed like to clasp wrists with Chief Kegporter and tell him that it was indeed an honor. Chief Kegporter, Lady Molly said, looking to the front row, do you accept? I do, Muldren said, rising to his feet. The senior-most Kegporter was a massively built dwarf, both broad and taller than average, like his firstborn son. Brushing his beard aside, he walked down to the stage. The audience cheered and laughed. His victory was epic. The crowd hailed him, laughed for him, and chanted his name. It was then that the ruckus was suddenly broken by the dire words of Chief O'Baldrick, the most suspicious of the mountain chiefs. Hold all! I recognize him now. He is not Master Christie, but Christoph, the master assassin. Seize them! Protect the Kegporter! The fog of excess drink and the sheer surprise of O'Baldrick's revelation stunned everyone in attendance. Only Sir John acted instantly. Rising up, he hurled his seat away from himself and drew his belted sword, rushing forward to pull the Kegporter away from the assassin. He was then struck in the chest by the first of Apex's eye rays. The floating lord had suddenly appeared behind Christoph and his men, and all concerned drew back in shock and horror. Sir John was suddenly slowed as if he moved in a dream. Sir Beric produced a strange device and opened a doorway to somewhere. His brother moved like a leopard and heaved the suddenly sleeping Muldren through the portal. Beric followed them while Christoph casually reclaimed his ever-full fairy mug, bowed to the crowd, and then leaped after them. Apex remained only long enough to unleash all 10 of his eye's horrible powers. Brim Stonewarden was charmed into defending the beast, and it took 3 dwarves to bring him down alive. Mr. Kenworthy was hurled 50 feet and injured almost unto death. Sir Tiernan was turned to stone while calling for a sword. The hero of the day proved to be Tisno Chiselnook. If not for his selfless tackling of the Lady Molly, then surely she would have been disintegrated. Many in the audience fled in terror, injuring many in their panicked attempt to escape. But perhaps worst of all, Lord O'Baldrick suffered a terrible, flesh-searing injury and fell into a magical swoon from which he could not be awakened. Master Tomzu went to him. I believe that he can still be saved, he said, but I must return to my mother's alchemical lab in Northwell. Bring your clerics, swiftly now. All was chaos. All was suddenly woe. Shock and silence ruled the hall. The moment after the assassin's escape, they were completely and utterly gone. What in the 9 hells just happened? Lord Min rasped. And how did a floating lord get in here? I believe, Master Tomzu said, that Christoph had him magically hidden. He must have disguised the invisibility spell by keeping him near his fairy mug. My detection spell was tragically fooled. It's not your fault, Master Zu, the king said. It is mine. Should we search the fortress, my lord? Said the captain of the guard. Conduct your search, but we can be sure that they are no longer anywhere near the volcano. Search their wagon and their horses. Maybe we can find something useful. Yes, sir. Summon my advisor, Lord Min raged, and bring the healers. Chief O'Baldrick might not last much longer. There was then a flurry of activity. Runners were sent, and the word was passed. I fear that we have lost Sir Tiernan. Nay, my lord, said Tomzu. I will go home at once and return with a cure. Sir Tiernan was magically turned, and he can be restored by a powerful transfiguration spell. And what of O'Baldrick? The king asked. I fear that my healers will not be able to restore him. The floating lords possess a dark power that causes instant death to most beings. I believe that the chief's amazing fortitude is all that has saved him thus far. I will return with my mother Jackie Zu. She is the greatest healer in Northwell, and if anyone can save him, she can. I would be in your debt. Nothing of the sort, my lord, Tomzu said. This is a terrible tragedy, and I cannot help feeling responsible. In the meantime, We must save who we can and find answers. I'll return within the hour. Stepping safely away from the king, he then cast a complex spell and disappeared. Wizards, Lord Min mused. What of Sir John? I seem to have recovered, your eminence, at least from the beast's spell. I'm afraid that I cannot say the same for the drink. Truly that is a blessing. Your efforts to save Moldrin were commendable. It was strange. From the moment the creature's ray struck me, I could barely move. Kristoff and his men easily outpaced me. They will pay for this outrage. The men of Munson will join you when you raise the call. But first, we must know where they've taken him. The dwarves of the volcano have lost a leader this day, the king said. Perhaps we have gained many new friends and allies that we never knew that we had. You are a credit to your people, Sir John. I will take my squire and my other good men and scour the hills nearby. Perhaps we can discover something. I shall send a company of dwarves to aid you. There's no telling what trouble is afoot. I fear that the problems of the west coast have finally found their way here. Dragonia, none other. I shall await your company in the stables, Sir John said. My young squire, Eric, will prepare my horse and assemble my men. My raiders will be ready to move out within the hour. Look to the south road, Sir John. To the north, the mountains soon become impassable without climbing equipment. Very well, my lord. I shall return as soon as we've finished our search. The two warriors bent in farewell. What a disaster, grumbled the king. Bring me the master of spies. I must know who has seized the Kegporter. If the master of spies was in the citadel, then they would meet within the hour. It would take a miracle. Okay. Let's see now to Kegporter's prison. Moldrin awoke disoriented and completely unaware of what had most recently transpired. It wasn't his bed. Of that he was sure, because it was very comfortable, with the softest, smoothest sheets that he'd ever felt. He must have passed out from too much drink, but what bedroom in the volcano had such plush accommodations? Beside him, a goblet filled with some orange-colored juice stood beside a plate of biscuits and other snacks. Amazingly hungry, he tore into a small loaf of bread and downed half of the juice. Delicious! Never before had he tasted such a fruity beverage. He'd have to think about adding some of it to his summer brew, but something was definitely wrong. He was dressed only in a nightshirt and loincloth. His clothing, armor, and weapons were gone. Across from the bed, his room only had one small window. Parting the curtains, he looked down upon a vast plain. Beyond that, a forest, stretching to far distant mountains. Beneath him, rising up from somewhere far below, stood the point of an enormous monolith, a great pyramid. My God, he thought, the orcs have taken me prisoner, but how? His room was furnished, with but a single door, iron-bound, thick and strong. He tried the handle, and as he had suspected, it was locked. He searched through his thick beard for the thieving tools that he'd kept there ever since his adventuring days, but these too were gone. Orcs weren't smart enough to have discovered them, nor was it likely that they could have built such a high tower as this one. Looking out of his window again, he seemed within arm's reach of the clouds. He was high up indeed. On one end of the room, a strange device stood within a small alcove. Short and squat, it looked like a bird bath filled with water. A round container rested behind and above it, with a brass handle attached to a dangling chain. Beside it was a small open chest with some rolled parchment and a folded letter. Moldrin, please make yourself at home, as you are now a guest of the Dragonian Empire. The device before you is an ingenious mechanism called a toilet. When you must relieve yourself, please sit and do so here. When you are through, a quick pull of the handle will remove your waste. Give it a try. It's quite remarkable. Don't worry. Clothing will be brought to you within the hour, as well as food and books to pass the time. My lieutenants will visit you soon and explain your captivity. I hope that your stay here will be a pleasant one. Sincerely, Captain Vlad Lucheron. Dragonians, he pondered. Here? Out of curiosity, he pulled the handle, and water was suddenly sucked out of the bowl and replaced with new water from above. Crafty. But why would they capture me? He had only one guess. His firstborn son was up to some mischief again. One-eyed Jacks. Mischief indeed, I said to the boys, but little did Moldren know that at that precise moment we were battling for our lives in the vast labyrinths of tunnels beneath Modrul's mountain. What happened to him? Polly asked. Did the dwarves rescue him? Lordmen would have tried, but even the entire dwarven army couldn't have defeated the orcs in their pyramid fortress at that time. But the king had no way of knowing where Moldren was being held, so he couldn't have rescued him. Lord Min is a wise king, and he knew that above all else he needed information, and so he sent out spies far and wide and waited. As for us, we battled the dung beast in his putrid home, and to this day I wish that that battle had never been. That's where we'll end episode 11. Episode 12 will return us to Carmen and her rangers in dire straits with the monsters, in the continuation of the chapter entitled A Fistful of Dung on page 138. So we have that exciting battle to look forward to in the next chapter. Thank you for listening. As always, read The Drums of Doom, Kerr's Rage Part 1, Drums of Doom Part 2, and all the following novels by me. Thank you and have a great night. And especially look forward to The Ice Moon, Part 4, the conclusion of the Duaredheim Staff Saga. Awesome. Have a great night.